Good evening. I think we should get going so we have enough time for discussion. Good evening, and thank you for being here for this keynote talk that would kick off a conference, Slums, New Visions for Enduring Global Phenomena. And I welcome you here on behalf of the Lincoln Land Institute and the Joint Center for Housing Studies and the Graduate School of Design. And I hope you'll also come for the next 2 days for the conference. And before I go on to introduce our keynote speaker, Ranjani Mazumdar, I want to quickly thank Dr. George McCarthy, known as Mac, President and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and Dr. Chris Herbert, who is the Managing Director of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, for having facilitated and supported this effort and made the GST a partner in this process. For me personally, these are important efforts that I believe create true interdisciplinary conversations around really wicked problems that we face globally. And it has really been an educative process to be part of the discussion in evolving a format and thrust for a symposium such as this one. Dr. Enrique Silvia from the Lincoln Land Institute, who also teaches here at the GSD, Alejandro Mazzaro, David. There are many others who you'll see and hear from in the next few days through the conference. And lastly, I want to thank Diane Davis, the chair of the Urban Planning and Design Department, for having supported this, and our dean, Mohsin Mustafafi, Ken and Paige, for making available the Piper for this inaugural session, and also including this as part of the formal GST lecture series. This symposium is about taking perhaps one of the most enduring problems on the planet, perhaps aside from climate change, and exposing ourselves to new frames of reference and developing new lenses to inform our approach to the global and systemic challenges that produce patterns of socio-spatial poverty. Of course, there's been much discussion about slums, and even the use of the word slums we really deliberated, because the word slum has a longer and more continuous history of usage and reference that has perhaps made it more enduring than the more recent 4 or 5 decade old use of the word informal, which also, in my view, sets up an unproductive binary sometimes, at least from a socio-spatial planning and design perspective. And I just wanted to make that point here in the design school. In fact, Francis Lanier, who also taught here, doesn't even use the word slums because he feels that's a generalization. He uses the word shanty towns and its cultural invention as a phenomena. And so I think the usage of these words is something we're going to deliberate to perhaps come up with a more constructive, productive, and instrumental narrative. I mean, if you look up the dictionary, the slum is a squalid, overcrowded urban street, distinctly habited, very often by poor people, hovel, ghetto, shantytown, favela, juggi, jopri, basti, cabbage town, rookery, many such suggestions, but of the physical state of a place, of a settlement, its material and condition. And of course, used as a verb, slumming it out, that means spending time at a lower social level than one's own through curiosity or a charitable purpose. So it's used in different contexts. And informal, which is off the record, unauthorized, unsanctioned, confidential, unconfirmed, etc., also has great potency. The word slum clearly is directed towards physical and material existence of a habitat. So in this context, I think we must understand that cities as a set of disparities are a set of disparities between the intentions of formal modes of practice and their spatial manifestation on the ground. Thus, perhaps no one category is really adequate to describe this phenomena in the world today. I often here in the design school, I'd like to share this. Mark Angeli, who's a professor at the ETH, once shared with me their big project on Ethiopia. And it was a project that was incredibly well funded, and they were looking at informal settlements. And so they took 20 students, got a bus, spent 2 days identifying an informal settlement, spent 8 days mapping it, photo montages, measure drawings, and they kept the last day for interviews. Now, social scientists would have done exactly the opposite. And so after they finished their incredible documentation, in the second interview, they discovered it was actually a formal settlement. It only looked like an informal settlement. And so I just want to say this in a design school because the aesthetic question also becomes a very important one. And the baggage we carry of that lens of aesthetics is also highly problematic sometimes. And I hope we can together peel away some of these layers in our discussions. So We have oscillated between the word informal slums, and like I said, in my own understanding, it encodes the physical material condition. Informality is the process of becoming and operating. And so if you look at governance and claims and modes of citizenship and many other political questions, informal, of course, is a much, much more productive category. And so there is this continuing tension that we have to somehow resolve, because they're intrinsically linked. And often the discussions around these terms are non-productive, because we unintentionally inflate one or the other more often and then sometimes use them interchangeably. We've also focused on slums because these spaces, for all our three institutions involved, challenge our usual notions of housing, land occupation processes, as well as urban form and urbanism more broadly, versus the making and imagining of the ideal manifestation that we all aspire to, which is to say that the formal city also produces slums. Slums really present a compelling vision that potentially allows us to better understand the blurred lines of contemporary urbanism and the changing roles of people and spaces in urban societies. In this context, an architecture or urbanism of equality in an increasingly inequitable economic condition requires looking deeper to find a wide range of places to mark and commemorate the cultures of those who most often are excluded from the spaces or architecture and urban form of global flows. And the camera, as our keynote speaker Ranjani has argued, has the ability to penetrate those lives in these otherwise marginalized spaces, which are hard to represent in any other abstract terms or form. Cinema, she argues, is not an institutionalized medium and thus is not taken seriously as a scholarly enterprise in its form. And it is for this reason that we choose to begin our symposium through the lens of film. Ranjani Mazumdar is a professor of cinema studies at the School of Art and Aesthetics at the Jawaharlal Nehru Institute, JNU as it's called. Her publications focus on urban culture, popular cinema, gender, and cinematic city. She's the author of Bombay Cinema, an archive of the city, which she did in 2007, and co-editor of a forthcoming Wiley Blackwell Companion to Indian cinema. Her writings have appeared in anthologies as well as journals such as Bioscope, Continuum Screen, Social Research, Journal of Television and New Media, etc. Very widely published. She's been a European Union Fellow in the on Indian films at the University of Westminster in London, a Fellow at the Davis Center of Historical Studies at Princeton University, a British Academy Fellow, a Fellow in Paris, visiting faculty at the Department of Cinema Studies at New York University, and several other such positions. She has also worked as a documentary filmmaker, and her productions include Delhi Diary, 2001, and The Power of the Image, which she has co-directed. Ranjani's body of work and practice speaks about cinema's ability to both blur and perpetuate the formal versus informal binary that has become a definitive element in the approaches to the enduring global phenomena of slums. What can be said about the complexity of contested space where thousands, even millions of other individuals are staking their own claims? How does one even begin to frame the issue without simplifying it? Perhaps cinema offers us a point of entry. Cinematic creative projects have the ability to blur the boundaries and prevent us from realizing concrete and fixed assumptions about the world. What if we understand the informal city and the slums they produce as the expression and representation of the unrealized aspirations of the formal city? How might this lens inform our understanding of the broader visual landscape as another space where the most extreme have-nots lack agency? To work in the contested space of slums, we must recognize is a political choice. When we examine the role, for example, today of doctored videos and fake news items, which have played a major role in fueling the flames of our current political climate, we recognize the power of the visual to blur or sharpen boundaries of privilege and power. Such a reality became explicitly clear to our speaker in recent years. Since February 2016, the students and teachers at the JNU University, where Ranjani is a professor, have been at the receiving end of extremely hostility by the Indian national government, the BJP BJP. The president of the Students' Union, Kanhaiya Kumar, was arrested and charged with sedition for supposedly shouting anti-national slogans at an event on Kashmir. 6 other students were arrested. These events led to countrywide protests, political debates in parliament, heated discussions on issues related to nationalism, patriotism, the freedom of expression, and the laws related to this. Teachers say the ecosystem of the university, known for its liberal views and culture of political activism, is in a fragile state of existence. Teachers went on a hunger strike, and there have been all sorts of protests. Here in most of the academy in the United States, we are privileged. It's hard to imagine that, for example, an institution like Harvard, for example, coming under some similar fire, where our daily lives are not impinged on in complicated ways. Perhaps not. Maybe we are close to that. But when our voices are suppressed, how do we keep integrity? Can we also think about and be aware of our academic environment as another space where slums are defined not by their inhabitants, but by experts, practitioners, and scholars? And what does this mean is something I think we should also be aware of. What are the aesthetic decisions we make as designers and professional policymakers and academics when asked to represent the space and define what we call slums? And I think this is the type of dialectic space that we hope the symposium will foster. The keynote lecture will be followed by a discussion which will involve Janice Perlman and Brodie Fisher responding to the lecture, and then a discussion moderated by George McCarthy, who's the president of the CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Lincoln Institute seeks to improve the quality of life through effective use, taxation, stewardship of land. He will tell us more about the institution and its work in the coming days. But as a short intro, what I would say is Mac is well known for his blunt and honest views and his ability to challenge as well as inspire those he works with. He's long seen land use policy as a means to reach equity goals. He's worked for his role as a teacher, researcher, and funder. He will introduce the respondents after the keynote lecture. And with that, I invite Professor Ranjani Mazumdar to deliver her keynote lecture titled The Cinematic Slum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rahul, for the introduction to the symposium and to my own work. I feel honored to have got this invitation to kickstart a symposium like this, and I hope I can provoke some new types of questions with what I have to say today. And I will not waste much time and begin immediately because we want to stick to a tight schedule. The slum has been a visual force in a number of city films from across the world. The use of certain geographical locations in popular discourses about crime and poverty have given shape to a diverse range of images that are at once powerful, mythic, and disturbing. I would like to present today an account of some of the perceptions that have fueled the imagination of the cinematic slum. Let me start with a discussion of the planetary consciousness at work in some of the literature on slums, and then trace its relationship to photographic and cinematic forms. As I will show, this planetary vision, often influenced by certain kinds of urban plans, policies, and academic discourses, translates into an aerial imagination. These aerial views are, however, constantly threatened by an overspill of challenging images that foreground a dense slum ecology. Whether exploitative, sensational, or prone to accusations of poverty porn, the range of cinematic images offer a hypersensory encounter with the world of the slum. These encounters rely on certain techniques that are unique to cinema and therefore provide an alternative form of knowledge that is different from sociological, historical, and economic accounts of slums. I hope to focus particularly on the visceral, violent, and embodied forms of experiences that the cinematic slum has become known for. In his book, Planet of the Slums, Mike Davis presents us with an apocalyptic account of a future overwhelmed by the expansion of slums. Large-scale migration to the cities has resulted in congested spaces, and the slum is now a fait accompli. While slums have been a presence in most cities of the world in the second half of the 20th century, the global south has increasingly witnessed a concentration of squatter settlements. Davis's account is powerful. It makes us sit up with a sense of shock and asks us to understand the power of statistics and data that he parades for the reader. The whirlwind of staggering information is meant to shake us out of our reverie, to recognize a crisis that is at once economic, social, political, and ecological. The cover of the book provides us with a high-angle view of a Brazilian favela. A decade after the publication of Davis's book, Johnny Miller, in his award-winning photographic work titled Unequal Scenes, captured aerial views of inequality. Miller started work initially in South Africa, but soon branched out in 2016 to use drones for the capture of striking images from around the world. These images provide high-angle views of major cities with dense clusters of low-income housing set against the wealthier districts. The countries where Miller took pictures include South Africa, India, Tanzania, the United States, and Kenya. The desire to generate these high-angle images came to Miller during his time as an anthropology student in South Africa. He was struck by the tin shacks and their existence right next to the affluent neighborhoods. Says Miller, and I quote, "The images that I find the most powerful are when the camera is looking straight down, what's known as nadir view, looking at the actual borders between rich and poor. Sometimes this is a fence, sometimes a road or wetlands, with small shacks or poor houses on one side and larger houses or mansions on the other. Whatever it is about the composition of those photographs, they are extremely powerful to people. I think the images make inequality relevant. People can see themselves reflected in the images, and it's deeply unsettling," end of quote. There is an uncanny resemblance in Davis's account in The Planet of Slums and Miller's photographs in his Unequal Scenes. Both capture broad trends in the world and focus on scale, numbers, and the desire to instill a sense of shock. There is something powerful in this spectacle of inequality, and it is hard to ignore it. The key issue, however, is the deployment of a distanced gaze, both in the book and in the photographs. This distance is created by an aerial perspective, a planetary view, so to speak, which recognizes an essential interconnectedness between all humankind and the earth, a relationship that transcends nations to foreground a shared vision of a united humanity. The aerial view, popularized since the experience of flight, is now a widespread form and has deeply affected the way we understand geography and territory. While aerial photography has been constructively deployed in the service of war, cartography, and archaeological surveys, we need to understand how this form of vision emerged so strongly as a cultural phenomenon. In the course of its history, the aerial view has offered us the fantasy of visual possession of vast space. Since this form of looking is distinctly different from ground-level perception, there is a quality of abstraction that comes into play in any high-angle view of the world. What we experience is a move away from a complex and contradictory reality to an image form where the unruly and the untidy appear tidy. This is a process where eyesores seen at ground level get transformed through aerial vision into striking forms of spectacle. Complex social contexts, lived realities, and experiences are reduced to a planar spatiality that instills a generalized notion of the universal. Davis's book has been classified as urban crisis writing by Ravi Sundaram, an apocalyptic imagination that seems to steer clear from the complexities that exist inside the slums themselves. Miller's photographs seem to carry Davis's ideas into his striking account of inequality seen from above. These descriptions, however, do not obviously capture the concrete experiences of the slums' inhabitants. As against Davis's apocalyptic imagination, we do also have other perspectives that have documented not just the concrete realities and experiences of those living in slums, but also provided access to the infrastructures of the informal economies that operate in these locations. The effort in these micro-accounts has been to trace patterns as well as distinct differences, to understand the diverse contexts of slum worlds, the way they look, operate, and survive. There are many examples of this kind of work. In Shadow Cities, Robert Neuwirth provides narratives of ordinary slum dwellers. For 2 years, he explored slums in 4 continents, and despite their world of poverty, despair, and political corruption, he experienced a great deal of the human spirit. The book has a strong tone of hope, and squatters are presented as entrepreneurs who cope by staying outside of the asphalt world, the term used by them to refer to the streets and political system of the legal city. The book takes us to a sense of community, a place of friendship and bonds, and a highly productive life. In some ways, these two opposing tendencies of expressing the expansive horror of the slum experience via numbers and statistical classification, and the search for a spirited community of residents engaged in informal networks of the economy has framed the popular dynamics of slum representations. In the cinematic world, however, this narrative becomes complicated. Danny Boyle's Slumdog Millionaire, released in 2008, became a major success across the world with its rags to riches story. Based on a novel, the primary structure of the narrative moves between a popular television game show, How to Be a Millionaire, and memories of one of the contestants, Jamal, a Muslim boy who grew up in Bombay slums. Just before the final round, when he is about to win a large sum of money, Jamal is picked up by the police for questioning because the host of the show can't believe a boy from the slum could possibly know all the answers to the questions asked in the show. The narrative does not try to be plausible or believable, for the focus clearly was to find a language with which to convey the memory of growing up in Bombay slums. The film was both controversial as well as appealing. There is a desire to penetrate the density of Bombay's slum world, to access its sensory fabric. Boyle deploys a cinematic language of encounters to explore the networks of the slum, to narrate the stories of two brothers. Yet the labyrinthine structure of the space defies any easy access to a totalizing view. A key issue for us here is that of navigation, since it is in the world of cinema that we have seen the most sustained desire to move into these spaces, to trade on various kinds of spectatorial experiences of fear, excitement, voyeurism, and thrill. This is absolutely central to the way the idea of the slum has become enmeshed in our thinking of certain kinds of urban spaces that we do not always know well, but have only heard of or learnt about via a global production of pictures and documents, news reporting, literature, and cinema. This indeed is what makes the slum iconography so difficult to establish, since its so-called authentic life is now no longer available outside this blitzkrieg of visual production. Slums are diverse, architecturally, socially, in terms of infrastructure, and in terms of their geographical locations within urban spaces. They are mysterious, always around, but never fully understood. So the techniques used by cinema have tended to play with the nature of the medium itself. Juliana Bruno refers to film as a form of modern cartography, where we can clearly see connections between space and emotion. Forms of mobility deployed by cinema usually take us across time and space to invoke a unique map of filmic affect. Slumdog revels in this kind of expressivity. The opening sequence in the film uses the chase, a popular device in cinema, to navigate Mumbai's slums. Boyle takes us to Dharavi as the site for the story to unfold. Dharavi is one of the largest slums in Asia and houses around 700,000 people. It is a complex space, a site of high productivity, poor infrastructure, outsourced labor, and global networks. Within this space, many different lives coexist, and not all these stories are captured by Boyle in Slumdog. And yet it is what he captures that is of particular significance for us to understand how a narrative of embodied knowledge is presented as a distinctly different imagination from the planetary consciousness at work in Davis and Miller's work. If the high-angle drone imagery that we have just seen seeks to generate abstract spectacles of shock, Boyle assaults our senses with a form of visual cartography to invoke the ecology of Mumbai slums.
Pick up the packs on my journey. Dogs run, they start to follow me. Hammer luck, some days they suck. We live for the buck, we get for the family. One day I wanna be a star, so I get to hang in a bar. I'll go to Vegas to the payers, just to forget my scars. Sorry. They can't touch me, we break off, run so fast they can't even touch me. Been that gypsy, touch me, I show you tricks with my zigzag quickly.
The sequence starts with a dynamic view of an airport track, the hazy apartment block skyline, the impish playfulness of the children, to finally enter the streets and bylanes of Dharavi as the children get chased by a police constable. The chase is superbly crafted, an energetic run that reveals various aspects of the space to us. Yet this is a form of mapping that foregrounds the bodily experiences of the children and their deft navigation across rooftops, alleys, water pipes, and staircases. The constable finds it difficult to negotiate the space. The children, on the other hand, have a relationship of play, as Boyle edits their speedy movement to music. We see the slum as a space with giant pipes, sewage, blue-colored plastic floating in water, narrow alleys, and a combination of tin and thatched roofs. The two kids really know their way around as the director moves from ground level to the high-angle shots showing the thatched roofs. This play between the high and the low is interesting since up close we get a sense of the slum as we blur through the alleys. This is typical for any chase sequence since its attempt is always to capture a sensorium and thrill of movement through what appears to be very dense space. Through this opening sequence, we are provided access to a form of spatial knowledge the children possess. A similar controversy about the sensational nature of the film shadowed Fernando Meirelles' City of God, released in 2002. City of God is based on a true story set in 1960s Rio, based on a best-selling novel by Paulo Lins, who grew up in a favela. The narrative moves between the 60s and the 80s and follows the different journeys of the two protagonists, Lil Z, a dreaded teenage gangster, and Rocket, another teenager who wants to become a photographer to escape the favela. The story unfolds from the point of view of Rocket. City of God adopted a style that relentlessly pummels the spectator with a tale of drugs, crime, and corruption located inside the favelas. It is intriguing how the opening of the film opens with a similar cartographic impulse as Slumdog, but with a distinctly violent edge to it.
Ih, a galinha fugiu! Ô, rapaz, você aí, meu irmão, pega a galinha, segura a galinha aí, rapaz! Vambora, porra!
Fica boa, cara, vou conseguir emprego no jornal.
Pô, tu acha mesmo, cara?
Tem que arriscar, cara.
Vai. Ó, tu tá arriscando tua vida toda por causa de foto, hein? Sai dessa.
Pô, cara, tu acha realmente que eu gosto de ficar cara a cara com aquele bandido filho da puta?
Pega a galinha aí, rapaz! Pega! Vambora, meu irmão, segura a galinha, rapaz! Ô, filha da puta, eu não mandei você segurar a galinha, rapaz! Seu arrombado! Senta o dedo na galinha!
Pegar, ele vai querer te matar, hein?
Pra ele me matar, vai ter que me achar primeiro.
Aí, moleque, segura a galinha aí pra mim! Pega a galinha aí! Não corre não, porra! Dá isso aqui! Ai, cabeção! Seu viado!
Uma fotografia podia mudar minha vida. Mas na cidade de Deus, se correr o bicho pega, e se ficar o bicho come.
Leva essas meninas de volta pra delegacia, rapaz!
E sempre foi assim, desde que eu era criança.
The significance of both these sequences lies in their attempt to carve out a mediatized imagination for a discussion of slums in a globalized world. Both films deal with the metamorphosis of childhood. This focus on childhood is not unknown in the history of world cinema, and yet there is something different about films like City of God and Slumdog. A brief comparison with certain depictions available from an earlier era may help to shed light on this. Hector Babenko's Pishoch, released in 1981, and Meera Nair's Salam Bombay, released in 1988, are two iconic films of the 1980s. Both films on childhood experiences of poverty were inspired by the Mexican film Los Olvidados, which translates as The Young and the Damned, directed by Luis Buñuel in 1959. In each of these films, the slum is the master narrative that is never overtly present in its architectural density, but is the infrastructural condition for the way the children experience life. Meera Nair's Salam Bombay deals with the lives of street children. Shot in the slums of Bombay, the film shows the story of Krishna, a 10-year-old boy who works for a traveling circus, but is abandoned when the employers move away abruptly. He then heads for Bombay and gets a job working as a tea boy. The film centers on Krishna's daily deliveries to a brothel and the assortment of characters he meets over there. Salam Bombay builds on a sentimental narrative, with the child retaining an intrinsically human quality that remains untouched by his circumstances. The film refrains from any direct articulation of physical aggression. There are intimations of potential violence, but we don't see them on screen, and the desire to hold on to some originary sense of innocence or absolute truth remains the dominant emotional texture of the narrative. Many critics and viewers have compared Nayar's venture to Babenko's Pishoch, released earlier in the decade. As abandoned cast-offs, the children of Pishoch live by their wits on the cruel streets of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Their survival depends on the trading of sex and drugs, as the narrative takes us through a series of events that act upon the children. Unlike Salam Bombay, there is something relentlessly brutal in Pishoch. It's like being in a no-exit world where not even the cleverest of the children can survive. A sense of desperation runs through the narrative with absolutely no hope available for the children. We are made to view a cataloging of strange atrocities where beauty is forever doomed and a sense of entrapment emerges as the dominant emotion. Babenko takes an ironic approach to the aerial view by opening the film with a straightforward introduction to the film's context.
170% do produto nacional bruto desse país. O Brasil é um país com 120 milhões de habitantes, que aproximadamente 50% estão abaixo dos 21 anos de idade, dos quais aproximadamente também 28 milhões de crianças vivem numa situação abaixo das normas exigidas pelos direitos internacionais da criança das Nações Unidas. Existem ainda aproximadamente nesse país 3 milhões de crianças que não têm casa, que não têm lar e que não têm origem familiar definida. A situação da criança é tanto mais caótica quando se sabe que a criança é só passivo de condenação por algum delito cometido após os 18 anos de idade, o que permite o aliciamento das crianças menores de 18 anos por parte de alguns adultos para que elas possam cometer algum tipo de crime ou de delinquência, sabendo que elas não serão punidas. No máximo, serão enviadas a um reformatório onde conviverão um par de meses, onde, pela pressão e pela falta de vagas, serão automaticamente colocados em liberdade. Esse bairro, por exemplo, se trata de um bairro onde vivem famílias de operários, de fábricas vizinhas, fábricas muito grandes. O quadro típico é que o pai e a mãe vão trabalhar e as crianças ficam em casa. E quem toma conta normalmente é uma irmã maior ou alguma vizinha que paga para isso. Fernando, por exemplo, que é o personagem principal do filme Pichote, vive com a mãe e mais 9 irmãos nessa casa. Certo? E o filme inteiro é representado por crianças que pertencem a esta origem social.
This opening, however, has little to do with the series of devastating brutalities we witness in the rest of the narrative. The opening introduces us to a broader context with statistics and a wide-angle frame of the slum. For the rest of the narrative, the actual slum disappears. This is a sequence from the reform school where Pishoch is sent.
Formulado pelo presidente Figueiredo, se baseou em considerações humanitárias e nos laços fraternos de amizade que unem Brasil e Uruguai. Em São Paulo, a violência nas ruas cresce dia a dia. Na madrugada de ontem foi encontrado morto o menor LCP que estava desaparecido há 2 semanas. A nossa reportagem, o diretor do Instituto explicou o seguinte.
As brigas são constantes entre os internos, dada a origem social dos mesmos. Quanto ao fato específico do menor que foi encontrado morto, já veio ao meu conhecimento de que o mesmo foi barbaramente espancado por um dos colegas de sua turma. Mas o agressor já foi identificado.
O menino espancador, AC, 17 anos, tem lamentável folha corrida. Assaltos à mão armada, agressões e um latrocínio. Um caso típico do menor delinquente.
Eu não sei não, viu, moça? Eu não sei não. Eu estive lá e ele não estava lá. Daí eles me disseram que ele que ele tinha fugido. Daí depois, quando eu fui visitar, eles me disseram que ele estava lá na enfermaria. Daí um menino me falou que era mentira e que a polícia que tinha levado ele. Eu não sei não, viu, moça? Eu quero meu filho.
Bom, eu acho que tem muito mistério em volta desse instituto. A mãe do menino esteve lá e viu. E eu também vi o menino lá na enfermaria todo quebrado. Ele não podia andar nem um metro. Como é que ele ia poder fugir?
Chega por hoje. Acabando o jantar.
Notice how the media here is a mediator between a public world and the reform school. The film's context of corruption, violence, and crime is a thread the children begin to understand after they hear this telecast on television. It is ironic that the boy who played Pichoch, Fernando Ramos da Silva, went back to the streets after the film was over and was ultimately killed by police bullets in 1987. In Los Olvidados, the film that influenced both Salam Bombay and Pichoch, the opening sequence introduces us to the port of New York, the island of Manhattan with its skyscrapers, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, Big Ben in London, and then downtown Mexico City. Buñuel's vision is informed by a healthy holism for whom poverty and the poor are shown in the unrefined reality of urban misery.
Las grandes ciudades modernas, Nueva York, París, Londres, esconden tras sus magníficos edificios hogares de miseria que albergan niños malnutridos, sin higiene, sin escuela, semillero de futuros delincuentes. La sociedad trata de corregir este mal, pero el éxito de sus esfuerzos es muy limitado. Solo en un futuro próximo podrán ser reivindicados los derechos del niño y del adolescente para que sean útiles a la sociedad. México, la gran ciudad moderna, no es la excepción a esta regla universal. Por eso esta película basada en hechos de la vida real no es optimista y deja la solución del problema a las fuerzas progresivas de la sociedad.
Buñuel's project was clear, a demystification of poverty, camera work that went against the usual techniques of social films. The film mocks its audience, savagely denying any space for middle-class sentiments, as it narrates the brutalized experiences of Mexico's urban delinquents. The use of these postcard and aerial views in the opening sequence was to address a Mexican audience about the existence of slums everywhere. Buñuel here was squarely negotiating the anxious nationalism of third world elites about the global circulation of films depicting poverty in their country. Pedro, one of the protagonists in the film, is sent to reform school by his unfeeling mother for a crime he did not commit. He escapes from there to make his way back to a fugitive life. He is finally killed by his friend from the street gang that they were all part of. The body is discovered by people who know Pedro, but fear of being implicated in the crime leads them to wrap him unceremoniously in a bag and throw him down a garbage dump.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
While these three very significant films on childhood are distinctly different in their approach, together they offer a set of interventions on the slum child's existence. In these slice-of-life narratives, events act upon the children and their bodies. Despite their very different styles, a binding element in the three films is the influence of Italian neorealism. Let me quickly describe some of the features of the cinematic style, which emerged in the context of post-war devastation in Italy and soon became a global debate about realism and cinema in the decades to follow. Where am I? In the decades to follow. Neorealists were committed to a notion of the everyday and contemporary. One of its theorists, Cesar Zavattini, referred to it as a dailiness of people's lives. The camera should just enter the ongoing unfolding of reality as a guest. Neorealists believed in an unconditional focus on the present to explore how people's actions were shaped by necessity and circumstances. Real locations, street images, the use of non-professional actors, and an analytical documentary style became the chief characteristics of the realist mode. There was a belief here in the ontological wholeness of the reality being filmed. They preferred the long take and depth in cinematography and did not appreciate the use of montage or any other stylization generated at the post-production stage. Nair, Buñuel, and Babenco used non-professional actors along with an overt use of many of the well-known conventions of Italian neorealism. The aerial view was ironically structured in two of these films, with a clear belief that observation from an externalized point of view was perhaps the best way to capture a sense of reality. Buñuel's Los Olvidados, however, played with surrealistic elements and remained unsentimental till the end. He was clear about the role of the camera and did not want to express some naive discourse on authentic reality. It is perhaps this film that in some ways offers us the entry point for a discussion of the hypersensory drives of both Slumdog and City of God. The most significant element in both films is the movement between past and present, and the stylized use of flashbacks, techniques that neorealism did not deploy. In both films, the children grow up, and the temporal play between childhood and the present offers an unusual instance of embodied knowledge that is foregrounded as a deep and felt experience. Yet there is no fixed identity that emerges since we have two sets of characters in each film, both following different paths, despite a common and shared experience. They are not sociological types, but subjects who approach life differently. Close to the end of City of God, Rocket, the narrator of the film, is confronted with a dramatic moment when the police suddenly arrive and start to round up the gang's leaders. Lil Z is one of the figures who is arrested, only to be taken to a secluded place where a deal is struck for his release. All this is captured by Rocket on his camera. This is something he is able to do primarily because of his embodied knowledge of the space. Let me show you a clip first before I offer my thoughts on the sequence.
Calma aí, pai, precisa resolver essa parada. Calma aí, calma aí.
Bora, pequena, vamos acertar nossas contas.
Bora, mano.
Ô, você não, meu irmão. Você é presente pra imprensa. Bora.
Aí, tem 10 mil aqui, meu irmão?
Quase tudo. Não tem mais nada pra te dar, meu irmão.
Chama isso aqui, chefia.
Devemos tudo só chama isso mesmo.
Solta ele aí. Libera ele aí. Que isso, meu irmão? Que não é esse aí? Isso é ouro, cara? Aí. Enche de novo pra gente, valeu? Tá devendo o resto. Vambora.
Guerra, filha da puta! Mas a galera tá morta, eu tô pobre!
Ai, pequeno, tu tá fudido, hein?
Ai, molecada, vocês têm que sair pra fazer uns assaltos aí, ó. Pra poder levantar minha boca.
Quem
Falou?
disse que a boca é tua, Zé?
É tá mesmo? Maluco,
Quem
mulher?
disse, meu irmão? Esse é pelo nosso amigo, filha da puta! Ataque soviético nele! A boca é nossa!
So we see Rocket running through the favela space with great confidence, a maze of decrepit walls, unclean streets, rooftops, and garbage. His camera captures the backdoor deals between the cops and Lil Z. This is immediately followed by Lil Z's murder by a rival gang of younger kids known as the Runts. The camera is a protagonist here precisely because it is in the hands of Rocket, who knows how to navigate the favela and draw on his embodied knowledge of it to get the best possible pictures he can. Making the world of the favela visible is dependent on who is photographing it. Once Lil Z is killed, the camera goes into a frenzied state to finally show us his dead body on the ground from the point of view of the camera that Rocket has. His speedy return to the site of the body this time is presented like an abstract blur. The details of the same journey made earlier is now rendered abstract. Perhaps the blurred form is asking us to reflect on the nature of embodied experience, which is showcased first through Rocket's run to the exact location from where he can get his pictures and then make visible into an abstract loop. In Slumdog, all the answers that Jamal provides are drawn from his own embodied experience of life. In a sequence early in the film, he is asked a question about the god Ram, and we are taken to a powerful moment from his childhood. Jamal's mother is washing clothes inside a water tank at the center of the slum, her two children playing in the water. Let me show you the sequence now.
wake up every morning wishing I didn't know the answer to that question. If it wasn't for Ram and Allah, I would still have a mother.
The sequence that we just saw begins with a high-angle perspective with the camera panning from the trains to the water tank. The public activity of bathing and fun for the children is suddenly interrupted by the train scene from Jamal's mother's point of view. Before she sees the rioters, she displays an instinctive knowledge of something that appears amiss. She just about manages to warn her children before she is bludgeoned to death by the rioters. As the children run through the slum, they witness a series of events: the house being burnt, a man on fire, stabbing, the looting, and the cops sitting in their van with no intention of intervening to stop the riot. These moments are woven into the fabric of the sequence as the language of architecture, news photography, uncanny intrusions, and the children's bewildered expressions provide the aesthetic form for the expression of violence. We then return to Jamal now in the studio, his face marked by a grave expression, a violent moment from the past, vividly felt even today. Jamal now gets his answer right. The specter of Ram, the reference to Allah, are all drawn into his complex account of a life seen in the slums. As he relays his answer to the TV show, the spectator is made aware of the nature of embodied experience, felt and relayed as memory. In doing this, Danny Boyle is privileging the sensory world of the slum inhabitant and moving away from a realist and objectivist account of life in the slums. Both films offer descriptions of sites and spaces which are conveyed through the language of memory. The recognition that the catastrophes of the past, present, and future are located in the spaces of the city saturates the overall vision of the films. The shadow of death and play creates an intersection between memory and setting, time and place. Memory gives form to the city just as the city transforms memory. Knowing a city well is linked also to childhood, the ability to play out the intersections between childhood impressions and the adult's ability to recall. It is this interconnectedness of perspectives that Walter Benjamin had described so vividly in his reflections on childhood as a conceptual framework for urban memory. The child provides a disruptive vision that punctures the notion of the adult's recall as stable and distant. The perception of the child, in a sense, becomes a privileged mode of knowing, but it is in the fullness of time, in the space of adulthood, that meaning is achieved retrospectively. The significance of the past comes to light only in the context of a pressing present. It is the complex relationship between the memory of a particular site and the site of that particular memory that is of immense importance in the narratives of urban recall. City of God and Slumdog Millionaire are unique for the way they operate through these landscapes of memory. They also draw on a form of mediatized language, televisual liveness, music television, news photography, the use of digital effects. These intermediate elements create their own sensorium, which some have described as hyperrealism. Both Slumdog and City of God adopt a multimedia expressivity. And it is interesting how the media itself is so crucially placed in both films. Jamal in Slumdog is speaking to us through television, while in City of God, Rocket's memory is channelized for the world through his photographs. In City of God, the events move at a pace that becomes difficult to retain for the filmmaker. There is a desire to recognize the media world and its circulation of popular culture to stage this entry into slum life. Though through these intersections, the films makes it clear that they cannot transcend into a planetary perspective. Rather, life itself has come to resemble the movies. Igor Kristik, in fact, suggests a connection between the gunshots and the camera in City of God. By drawing on a more general tendency of popular cinema, particularly in popular male action, horror, crime, or gangster film genres, the film probes the ethical limits of representing violence on screen. Narrative itself frays at the edges as events bleed through with great force. I hope through the presentations today, I have managed to foreground the distinctly different logic at work in the capture of slums, in the capture of slum life on screen. Thank you. I stuck to time.
Well, I guess that's a hard act to follow. Thank you, Ranjani, for the disturbing images. The goal of our 2.5-day venture here is not to disturb you entirely, although we don't mind disturbing you a little bit, but actually to provoke. And so I want to just take this as the first opportunity that I'll have to provoke you and say, after watching this, do we think that slums are a problem? And the reason I ask that is because if you look at the way we've entitled this 2.5-day venture, it's nothing about the problem of slums, but it's about an enduring phenomenon. And so what if we imagine that slums are the answer? And then the answer to what? Because maybe their endurance is the illustration of a fact that somebody benefits from their existence. And those who benefit from their existence have lots of reasons not to do things about slums. We come to this discussion after more than 100 years of attempts to deal with slums, and after more than 200 years at least of their existence at scale in cities. We haven't been able to do very much over 100 years, although we've talked a lot about it. And so I have an idea that maybe our account is wrong. And maybe our account wraps around it a narrative, like the narrative that film then reinforces, that then leaves us all feeling so numb and unable to act that we just assume that the problem is just either too big to deal with, or maybe we forget that slums themselves actually represent the answer to something. But what is it? I don't know, but maybe we'll find out in the next couple of days. So I'm George McCarthy, otherwise known as Mac, the president of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And I want to welcome up to the stage two respondents who are now going to have to make some sense out of the horror that we just viewed. And it was stunning, I have to say, but chilling. Brodwyn Fisher, professor of history from the University of Chicago. And Janice Perlman, all right, I guess I should have gone over there. That's good. And Janice Perlman, the president of the Megacities Project and researcher at the Columbia University. And so one of the things that Ranjani showed us is that how we view or where we view slums from are clearly an important fact, a point of view. And part of the point of view of the way we look at them are in still photos or even in images that only depict kind of a moment in time. And I think that maybe it would be useful to start with kind of a more historic perspective to actually put slums into a longer frame, a longer vision. So Brody, maybe you can give us some reflections on what we just saw and provoke us further. Thanks.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure especially to share the stage with these wonderful three colleagues. We have very little time, so I'm going to get straight to the point. As a historian of Latin America and Brazil, I'd like to do three things in these quick comments. The first is to try to place the informal city that we've just seen in these filmic representations, both in the context of time, to take us back in time and think a little bit about cinema in the early stages, particularly in Brazil, and also to take it to the realm of other kinds of cultural representation and talk a little bit about how film is very similar to other ways of representing the favela that we can see in other contexts and other spaces. I'll then second go on to talk about what is the nature of the messages that are coming from cultural production about the favela, particularly in Brazil, but also in this larger context. And lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about what that has meant in terms of the kinds of policies that tend to be created on the basis of the images and the visions that we see in film and that we see in other cultural representations. So it's actually really a privilege to be somebody who works in Brazil and to think about these issues, because Brazil has had places that have been identified as favelas, as shanty towns, as informal cities for almost exactly 120 years. 1898 was the date that the first favela was named in Brazil. It wasn't the first time that that kind of settlement existed, but it was the first time that it was named, and importantly, that was when it began to be thought of as a problem. And almost as soon as that kind of neighborhood began to be thought of by the elite, by architects, by planners, by governors as a problem, then it started to be represented in different kinds of media. The first filmic representations of favelas in Brazil are actually from the 1900s, from the very beginnings of the genre of film in Brazil itself, and they were not surprisingly representations of carnival. Carnival came from the favelas, and the music samba came from the favelas, and almost as soon as it began to make its way into the streets of Rio, you began to have photographers and filmmakers going and trying to catch snippets of that live action. You have the first actual lengthy film devoted to the favela in 1926. It was a rant against favelas that was meant to justify a removal campaign by a member of the Rotary Club and a very important influential policymaker named Matos Pimenta. And then in 1935, you had the first long action drama, not only that was the first one to be set in a favela, but a movie. It was called Favela dos Meus Amores, that was considered the very first serious, dramatic, national film in Brazilian cinema. So it wasn't only the first representation of a favela, but it was actually thought to be the beginning of the representation of some authentic vision of Brazil in the cinematic realm. And that juxtaposition is very important. It isn't just a kind of external representation of this place, but an external representation of this place as something that represents what Brazil is all about. And so that's a very interesting difference, I think, between the films that we've just seen and some of these early films. It was followed in the 1950s with two very important films that are understood as the beginning of cinematic realism in Brazil by Nelson Pereira dos Santos. One of them in 1955 is called Rio 40 graus, so Rio for 40 degrees or 110 degrees, and another one in 1957 called Rio Zona Norte. And then, of course, there's the very famous Orfeo Negro in 1959. And this series of films is actually the beginnings of the representations of the favela in Brazil. And it was coincident with the beginnings of these kinds of representations in other parts of Latin America as well, although I don't have time to talk about that. One of the things that's really interesting about these films is that they mimic, in many ways, other forms of cultural production. So we have, for example, in 1903, the very first example of a chronicler who goes up to the hills of Rio and wants to expose them to the rest of the world, wants to tell everybody what these places are like. That begins in 1903. You also have samba, which is a kind of popular journalism, and its material, its prime material from the very beginning, is to tell outsiders what the world of the favela is like. And this becomes, by the 1930s, Brazil's national music, right? And so Brazil's national music is about these places, usually very positive representations, the favela as a site of authenticity, of love, of community in this sense of togetherness and unity. It's also, of course, a space of blackness, and it's the first cultural medium in which blackness is really portrayed in a positive light, is through samba. You have photographers going up in the hills as early as the early 1900s. 1800s, and poets and novelists soon followed. There are, in 1935, 2 major novels that are set in favela communities and that project to the rest of the world what these places are all about. And then, of course, you have the modernist artists who very famously go up into the hills in the 1920s and 30s and produce not only paintings, but also other forms of more abstract visual art, and poets follow them up into the hills. All of this to say that cinematic representations are very old, and they're part of a whole kind of cultural construct that exists from very, very early on in the history of these kinds of settlements. Now, the second question, what does this cultural production tell us? Now, there's a very simplistic way of thinking about this, that it can tell us good things about the favelas and bad things about the favelas, right? And if we were to think about the movies that we've just seen, there is, of course, a deeper level where what we're seeing is the nature of the protagonists in these films, and I very much agree that there is in these latest representations a lot more depth, a lot more understanding of the meaning of what these places are. But they are overwhelmingly negative representations, representations of suffering, of violence, of extremes. And one of the things that's interesting about Brazilian films is that from the beginning, they're not completely about that. In fact, the early generation of films is much more about these experiences of human emotion, experiences of family, experiences of connection, experiences of all of the things that the sambas were telling the rest of the Brazilian public that favela life was all about. So they'll say the asphalt, the city, those are the fake people, those are the liars, those are the policemen and the authorities that come in to beat us up. But we here, we have invented this beautiful musical genre. We understand what human feeling is all about. We understand that greed is wrong in a way that people down there on the asphalt who are speculating on real estate don't understand. And we want you to see our authentic Brazilian black life here in the favela. And so there's this kind of positive representation that comes across in these early films that's very interesting. Of course, there's also a lot of negative representation, and films were used as propaganda pieces to try to build sentiment against what were understood to be all of the problems of the space of the favela as well. But I won't repeat that because that vision, I think, is projected far more than the positive vision that I've just told you about. But there's also a deeper level that I just want to spend the very few minutes that I have left explaining. And that is that whether these films and these other cultural expressions were positive or negative, whether they saw beautiful blackness or whether they saw degenerate, racialized ideas of misery and marginality, no matter which side of that they fell on, there are certain commonalities in all of these representations. And to put this in very few words, what it is that they're seeing in the favela is a space that is separate, a space that is enclosed, and a space that is fundamentally understood as other when you compare it to the asphalt, when you compare it to the city. You can even see that in Los Olvidados, in that clip that we just saw, this idea that you have these modern cities and then you have these other spaces. And the other spaces are in some ways timeless. They don't belong to modernity. They don't belong to what the rest of the city is about. So there's this separation. There's also this idea in all of these cultural mediums that you need a cultural guide, that you need some kind of intermediary that's going to take you, and this is from 1903 on, they actually say it outright. You can't go up to the favela by yourself. You need someone to take you and explain to you what is what, because you're not going to be able to navigate these alleys, you're not going to be able to understand. So whether the guide is the chicken in City of God, or whether the guide is the chronicler that was such a common persona in these early chronicles, you need somebody else to explain it to you, and that person generally in the early years is from the outside. They're not from the inside, as we just saw in those films. There's also an idea in all of these, as I said before, that this is a place apart. It is strange, it's picturesque, it's fantastical, it's grotesque, but it is another world. It is not the same world that the presumed observers are observing from. Right? There is this kind of separation between these spaces. There's also a notion that the rest of the city might exist, but there's an invisible frontier between these spaces. It's the aerial photographs that we just saw, but written into these texts much earlier than aerial photography was actually existing. And one very important exception to this is the film Rio 40 Graus, Rio 110 Degrees, which actually has an aerial view at the beginning, like you see in later films. But the aerial view is actually meant to open our eyes to the fact that the favela is much bigger than the city. that in fact, if you go away from the central touristic points in Rio de Janeiro, most people are living in these alternate spaces. And it really makes that point very clearly. But that's rare. In most of these films, what you're seeing are these very clear frontiers between these spaces. And finally, in all of these movies, everything is happening in the urgent present tense. And that's something that's very true, I think, in the films that we've just seen. Even though they have these historical flashbacks, there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of now, there's a sense that these are places where everything is always urgent, because life or death always depends on what is happening right now in these kinds of places, right? And this is very early on in the history of these places as well. All right, so finally, just a couple of sentences on what are the seeds that these images place for policy. Now, it would take a lot more time than I have to talk about the specific positive and negatives and the specific kinds of campaigns that these lead to, not only in Brazil, but in the rest of Latin America. There's a lot to do with that I don't have time to do it. But one point that I would like to, or 2 points that I would like to specifically emphasize. One of them is that films and other cultural media have tended to reinforce the notion that you need an outsider to understand and mediate these problems. That the policymakers and the people who are going to decide what to do about these problems, and even the people that are going to decide what the problem are, they are not the people that are the object of the gaze. They're not the people that live inside of the slum communities. You need a mediator, you need somebody from the outside to come and tell you what the problem is and how it ought to be solved. And the function of the people who appear in these cultural media tends to be to simply express the suffering, the problem, the experience of being a victim of whatever problem it is that's been identified by these mediators, right? And that, of course, is very important in policy terms, because it indicates that the people who should be at the table, the people who should be at this conference, the people who should be at the places where decisions are made, are the ones who are observing, who are being explained to by these mediators. They're not the people who are being observed. And I think that that's a very important function that a lot of cultural media have, and I would even say that a film like City of God continues with that function, even though we're seeing it from the perspective of this person who grows up. The filmmaker really did a lot to change the book that it was based on in ways that really reflect an outsider's gaze in important ways. And then finally, I'm just going to end with one last more provocative point, which is that in emphasizing the notion of these communities as being closed to the outside, as being self-contained, as being the expression in and of themselves of a problem. That is, they are problematic spaces. Maybe they're problematic spaces because they're victimized. Maybe they're problematic spaces because they're oppressed. Maybe they're problematic spaces because the people who live in them are somehow misformed, somehow full of anomie or full of violence or full of rage. Whatever the reason, these are portrayed as problematic spaces. And they're also portrayed as spaces that are not defined by their connection to what is outside of them. And I think that fundamental insight, that notion that the problem that we need to solve is within the favela's borders, has consistently misshapen the sorts of policy remedies that are being proposed both by the left and by the right, and even sometimes by the communities themselves. And that if we were to take an aerial view that's not like Mike Davis's notion of an aerial view, but take an aerial view that actually tends to emphasize what Rio 40 Graus, what Rio 110 degrees could see, which is that these are spaces that in all kinds of ways are fundamentally connected, not only physically and economically and socially to the rest of the city, but these are also spaces that serve a function within the systems of economic inequality, and also the systems of power relationships that govern the city as a whole. That is, these are not places that are there by accident, but they are places that actually have a place in larger structures of power, larger structures of inequality, that are the actual roots of the problem. It's not what happens within the favela's borders that causes whatever aspects of favela life result in suffering or are problematic. The problem is actually in that relationship between those spaces and these larger structures of power. And cultural representations tend to downplay that by focusing on the favelas as spaces apart, as spaces that deserve to be focused on without reference to what's going on around them. And I think that's something that we can really take forward, I hope, in the next couple of days of discussions of this conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Brody. And because I'm blunt, I will restate your point in a different way, which is to say, what if slums or favelas or these alien other places within our cities are not just integral to the life of the cities, but they're integral to the success of the cities. The cities themselves would not thrive and flourish without the existence of those favelas. So that was our provocation. We're going to try to reserve a little bit of time for questions. We have a couple of people with microphones in the audience, but I want to turn to Janice now to get her provocations and her views on the amazing things we've seen already today.
So is this live?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Bertie, and thank you. That was just, it's a very hard act to follow. I'm very thrilled to be here, and well, I'm still in the emotional throes of seeing those visuals. I just wanted to start, while I was listening to, I thought of just starting by reading, since this is in the Graduate School of Design and it's architecture, reading a quote that describes the new urbanism. This is from The Guardian of April 30th, 2014. The new urbanism provides for communities which were robust, resilient, sustainable. They have high density and low cost, living in locations within reach of work by foot or bike. They are closely knit with self-reliant communities in which ties of families and neighborhoods are strong. Well, if I ever heard a description of a favela or any other squatter settlement, that's it. So, I mean, that's to answer your question of, wouldn't it be wonderful if this is the way, this would be the model, instead of getting into an elevator in a high-rise building after you go through a gate and then looking at the ceiling or the floor to not make eye contact with the other people in your building. So this is why in my book, Favela, I wrote a little poem called Why I Love Favelas. So my points, I just wanted to say that, number one, if you look at the way images of favelas in Rio have metamorphosized over these years, I would say it could be said to go from the slandered slum to the inclusive city to the fetishized favela and back again. Squatter settlements are the fastest growing percentage of the world's population right now. And they have constantly been, as you described, seen as other. So I was going to pick up on this concept of how powerful the ideology is and the image we have of favelas and how easy it is to blame the victim once you see these. And I was just going to give a little whirlwind tour very quickly through how the circular relationship played out in Brazil from the beginning of my research in 1968 during the military dictatorship to my current research, which was from 2015 to this last month. So it shows exactly what Brody was saying, this powerful relationship and interrelationship between the images we have and the visions we have in our heads and public policy. What makes public policy possible and acceptable is the images that are sold to us as what the policy is acting upon, the people and the spaces the policy is acting upon. So during the dictatorship in Brazil, which started in 1964, favelas were seen in the usual way you've seen portrayed: dangerous, dirty, violent, family breakdown, prostitution, crime, every possible thing, unhygienic. And if you read any of the original discussions of any squatter settlements anywhere in the world, you'll see these same unhygienic metaphors. Even Gordon Parks, who did the wonderful photography in Rio in 1961 of Catacumba, one of the favelas I lived in, he talked about the pathetic story of Flavio. There are pictures in his book of a little kid with cockroaches crawling over him and little Flavio with his shirt torn. And it was all about the pathos and how pathetic and how we have to come in and help them and raise money from Life magazine readers. I mean, I lived in that community a few years later. There was nothing pathetic about it. People were working, organizing, fighting the government to get urban services, withholding their votes from the one place they could vote for, which is city councilman, to bargain with among candidates for better improvements. I mean, they're really savvy and really well organized. And yet these images of favelas as the so-called cancerous sore on the beautiful body of Rio de Janeiro made it very easy to justify removal, the bulldozing down, the massive destruction of people's lives. This community where Flavio lived, Catacumba in the south zone, the wealthiest zone of Rio, people were removed. They were threatened by police violence and removed in garbage trucks to public housing projects outside, in greater distance from their work and school and health access than they could navigate. And they were put in public housing projects, including the City of God. That was one of them. And other names that came from the Alliance for Progress. There's one of the places was called Villa Aliança, Aliança para o Progresso, and one was called Villa Kennedy. So the United States was complicitous in this idea that this was cleaning up and improving the lives of these people, with, again, no reference to what the people would like or choose or their own trade-offs. And the other thing is that once they were located in these public housing projects, they were made to pay 25% of their previous family income every month towards a rent. And since their family income decreased by 75% because they no longer could work 2 or 3 jobs, and their kids couldn't work after school, and the wives couldn't get in, it was too expensive for the transportation, many of them defaulted. And in their defaulting on these payments, they were sent to what is very well could be described as debtor's prison. They were called casa de triage houses. Triage in war of the patients who were too sick to be worthy of the scarce medical supplies and left to die on the battlefield. So they were left to die on the battlefield. And the pictures I was going to show before we decided not to show any PowerPoints in this section would show these triage houses, which were way out in the boonies. You see on the map, they're not connected to anything, all lined up, little boxes in the baking sun, and then show more and more and more being built. And then I zoom from 1973 to 2011, and I show the same houses, rows and rows of them with and that's the new Brazilian housing project called Minha Casa Minha Vida, My House, My Life. They couldn't come up with one new design with all those brilliant architects and planners from 1973 to 2010. So, I mean, really. So, okay. So my research in 1968 and 69, I lived in 3 favelas in Rio. And what I found out exactly was that the reason I call my book The Myth of Marginality was that these people who live in these communities were not marginal at all. In fact, they were totally, tightly integrated into the rest of society, just in a very asymmetrical manner. So they gave their labor, their political support, their social and cultural lives to the city, but got almost nothing back in return. And my mantra was, they're not socially disorganized, which is what they were supposed to be, but they're excluded. They're not culturally backwards, but they're stigmatized. They're not economically parasitic, but they're exploited. They do the jobs that no one else would do in conditions no one else would accept, for salaries that no one else would work for. And yet they're taken for granted and treated terribly. And they're not politically radical. No one had to be scared of them making any revolution. They were so happy to be in the city, and they weren't comparing themselves to the rich people who live next to them. They were comparing themselves to the people back on the farm. And in comparison, they were doing great. And they knew they were investing for the future generations. So the policy implication of the fact that they were seen as marginal was to get rid of them. And so it was very easy to justify the massive removal of 100,000 people. They were burned out, they were shot out, they were totally traumatized. Fast forward, the end of the dictatorship comes the democracy. 1985, the new democratization, and we all think that, of course, we're never, ever going to see removal again, because now favelas, who are either 20 or 25% of the population of the city, now they're going to vote, no one's ever going to remove them again. And so the new idea is incorporate them in the inclusive city, and then there's upgrading. And so the policies, the visuals about favelas starting to be better. Films come out like Favela Rising, which shows these beautiful nonprofit organizations like Afro Reggae that organize kids as an alternative to going into the drug gangs. They can go into an equally bonding social group that's based around music and rhythm and song and expressing the words of living in a favela. So all of this gets translated into massive programs of on-site upgrading, where infrastructure is brought to the favela that's supposed to equalize the infrastructure that's happening on the asphalt. And at this moment, there's a very nice political alliance between the city government, the state government, and the federal government, and there's a big program called Favela Bairro, which is jointly funded by Inter-American Development Bank and the national Brazilian government and the city. Unfortunately, just at the time that democracy returned and everyone got out of jail, all of the war on poverty that the U.S. was running and closing the Colombia borders redirected the narco traffic through Brazil. So now all of this drugs were flowing into Brazil, especially cocaine, and it was taken into the favelas where it could be divided into smaller parcels and where the police had usually not penetrated, especially after democracy, because police had been very abusive. And so the idea of Brizola was, let's just police the asphalt. So aside from those winding streets where you see the chase scenes, there was a very convenient way to hide this drug traffic. And even though less than 1%, less than 0.01% of the people in the favelas were doing any drug trafficking or drug use, the return to the idea of favelas as a place of criminality, violence, and danger swept back, and all the images swept back, and there many, many films came out about the violence, and Squadrão da Morte and Tropa de Elite, and terrible, terrible things about the violence, the drug wars. Okay, then so the media, of course, is promoting this, the global one, television, and you see this always, photographs of violence and death in the papers. Okay, fast forward. Then I get to come to my second study. So my second study was 30 years later, after I lived in these favelas. I interviewed 750 people, 250 in each of 3 favelas. So I tried to find them again 30 years later. I found several hundred, more than 41%. And I interviewed them, and I interviewed their children and their grandchildren. And I already had interviewed their parents or asked about them. And then I found that I started documenting this metamorphosis of marginality and the actual social mobility that many of the kids, not the original people in their own lives, not so much their children, but in the grandchildren's generation, they really started to have some integration into both the economy, the social fabric of the city, and polity. And they really, about half of them were no longer living in a so-called marginalized area. However, the prejudice and stereotype against living in a favela, where 50% of them still live, was so powerful that despite the fact that they were in universities, that they had the same level of household domestic appliances as the average of the entire municipality of Rio de Janeiro, they never got to be treated with respect. They were never treated with equal standing under the law. They were never, killing them was never prosecuted. No, there was enormous disregard for the humanness and dignity of these human beings just because they lived in a favela. At the time when, over these generations, prejudice, their experience of being discriminated on for dark skin just started going away and lightening up. At the end, the kids didn't find it a huge discrimination or being women or being anything. But living in a favela, yes, it was the biggest source of their being discriminated for jobs or anything else. So then I wrote my second book, Favela, which talks about these many longitudinal study, many generations. And the recent thing I wanted to report on was that I've been studying the effects of the Olympics, the World Cup and the Olympics, on the favela communities and what has happened in these last 3 years. So now there was a new excuse, getting ready, cleaning up the city for these mega events, opened the doors to the unthinkable return of favela removal and an unthinkable occupation 24/7 of military police living inside the favelas, carrying guns and using them and using their bullying power at will, which ended up increasing violence in the city and ended up removing another 177,000 people under the excuse of getting ready for the Olympics. So it was kind of back to the future. I don't have time to tell you about the interplay between research and practice in public policy, so I'll skip that and go right to my lessons learned. Okay, so I'll talk later about the 25-year lag time between knowledge creation and research and public policy, but I'll go right to what I learned in these 50 years of work. One, it's extremely difficult to change people's attitudes, perceptions, and belief systems. They are very, very deeply entrenched, and media can fan these fears and these images very easily, as we just saw. Two, it's even more difficult to change people's behavior. You might even open their minds a little, but changing their behavior is very, very much more difficult. Three, it's even more difficult to change public policy. And four, it is more and more and more difficult to change the way public policy is implemented. So I've seen the words in public policy get to be perfect. Citizen participation, monitoring and evaluation, community control, community decision-making, arrangements with the government to hold accountable, blah, blah. Nothing. When it gets down to the implementation on the ground, the projects are delayed. It's easier to remove them, put a public housing project there. We started too late, no time for baseline evaluation, forget the citizen participation. So I put to us the challenge of this sentence that I also have in one, a cartoon in my PowerPoint that someone drew for me, a Brazilian. And it shows a guy drawing a little plant. And then it says, to plan is human, to implement divine. And then it shows him watering the plant and trimming it. And so to end up, the new book that I'm working on now is called A Importância de Ser Gente, the importance of personhood. And it's all about the bottom line is whether we can treat the other as a human being with dignity, who is not invisible, who is a creator and producer of culture and intellectual capital, not a consumer of the intellectual capital and culture that the elite is producing. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Janice. And to just put another blunt point to it, what if the pathology is not intrinsic to the slums, but it's actually part and parcel of our reaction to them, and part and parcel of the way we refuse to bridge that kind of gulf of otherness, which is very often reinforced by the images we produce in our films, in our media, in our news, that tell us that we do not want to cross that bridge because we can only do it with a guide, right? So we have a couple minutes for questions if there's anybody with burning questions, and we have a couple of microphones out there. Let's try to keep them quick.
Okay. Yep. This is probably a response to Mac's bluntness, provocation. Do you think it's fair? I'm interested in all of your reactions to this. Do you think it's fair to to think of slums as actually a vehicle for socioeconomic mobility. In my experience, slums are often places where there's incredible entrepreneurship, innovation. It provides investment opportunities for families, low-income families, to invest outside of the formal economy in their homes. Granted, there's a lack of basic services. Do you think that's a fair way to view slums, or is somehow that neglecting some intrinsic problems that we should be addressing?
Well, my answer is I think it is a fair depiction, and I think Sheila and others that are part of this will say yes. In fact, these are thriving areas of both of shelter and commerce. And in Dharavi, what do they produce? 20-something% of the GDP of Mumbai, right?
I think we should take a few questions.
No.
Could I get in?
Yep.
Just
Other
to say quickly
questions?
that I think the answer, like in so many of these things, is yes and no. That is that it's absolutely clear, every place I've ever been, that these are oftentimes the only way that people who come from regions where they don't have any economic future can find social mobility, can get their kids in school, and you see really over the 120 years, you see remarkable social mobility, and people struggle for it and they fight for it, and it's the battle of their lives. But this is where the point gets to take our focus away from these as separate spaces and think of them as connected to larger structures. Because how much would that energy be rewarded more if these were not places that were stigmatized by the vulnerabilities that come along with not being legally sanctioned? People pay costs for informality, even as informality gives them opportunity. And so the problem is not the slum itself. The problem is the burden of vulnerability that is placed on that neighborhood by being called informal, by being called illegal, by being called a slum. So that's what I would leave
Right,
with.
and people say, look how much they can do with $50. Look how much they made happen with $150. They don't say, imagine what they could do if you gave them real money. It's just like, well, they can get along on so little and they make so much of it. So that's sort of to follow up what you said.
Do we have any other burning questions? I think you're all as stunned as... Alex has a question.
First of all, a wonderful evening you're providing us. I go back to cinema because I think what I'm hearing and also what I'm seeing, and when I look at this problem historically, especially in the United States, is that the conception creates all sorts of obstacles to improvement. And so I'd like to go back to the idea of the complexity, the community, all those kinds of things that might have been in the early cinema. And of course, that's a kind of trope also, to find the authentic and sort of, which you see in early American cinema and as well. But anyway, the question would be, is there a way, or are there filmmakers who would take a different angle and not take this dichotomy that was so obvious in your original aerials, where it's always this versus that, and get at the complexity and the interconnection of urban life? If we just said these are cities, and some of the parts of the city look like this, some parts look like that, we'd have a whole different story to tell. So that would be my question.
It's on, just...
Okay, so the thing about cinema is that, and this is a question that's posed all the time to filmmakers, because cinema approximates the illusion of reality, so it's seen as a vehicle of representation. It's not representing. None of these films are representing any authentic reality. They are entering this universe of what they imagine urban life is to produce a different kind of expression. No? So I would like us to think about cinema as an expression. These are expressions of an experience. It's not about capturing authentic reality, which is why I started off by saying that this is a different form of knowledge that has no relationship directly with sociology, economics, because it's about affect. It's about bodily sensation and that sensorium. And I think the way in which these last two films, City of God and the fact that it disturbs, for me, is the great success of these two films, that it tends to disturb. And if you see Buñuel's film 1959, that is also really disturbing because there's no place for us to escape into, feeling a sense of pathos. And for me, that's the key question here. What is agency? These are all people who are agents of what they are doing in these films. So in that sense, the depiction of a world of the slum in which we feel we can capture the complexity, to me, seems like a bit of a myth. It's not really possible. That's the whole point of these films, is that they, even when they're at ground level, you can't see everything. And from an aerial perspective, you see even less of what that experience is. So it's the density of this ecology. It's not about capturing a vision, but it's about understanding what is this ecology. It is dense, it is difficult, and it is complex. So as a practitioner and in seeing world cinema and the way that world cinema has interacted with all these different geographical territories and tried to deal with these questions, it's always this difficulty, the problems of vision. No, it's about the limits of vision and what you can and cannot capture. And that arrogance cinema will have even less than academics. Filmmakers cannot work with that arrogance that I will show it all to you. That's the whole myth of the concept city versus the labyrinthine city, that you feel that you can transcend to a point from where you can actually illuminate. But there is that tension that runs throughout. And that is the tension that these films capture. So it's that tension that I think is very interesting for us to think about these questions. And though I feel that some people saw City of God as disturbing, and Slumdog Millionaire was really trashed in India, all for the wrong reasons. There was some vague nationalism that came to the fore, and suddenly there was total denial. India doesn't have slums. This is what we saw in all the newspapers. Total denial. So for me, it was an event. These are events. Film should be seen, these kinds of films should be seen as political, social events that open a world of debate and discussion. And it also makes us confront some things about ourselves also as spectators. We are comfortable about seeing it in a certain way. And when it doesn't go in that direction, then we are disturbed. And so that judgment comes very easily. And that's why, and I've got into trouble about this many times, I do believe that the aesthetics of violence is a very powerful mode today. And unless we recognize what it's doing, how violence is actually communicating something, it'll be difficult for us to understand what is actually shifted in cinema in the recent past. So I think that's, for me, it's important to really think about the tension and not feel that this is a problematic representation, because it's not trying to represent, it's trying to introduce us to a tension that exists over here, and then think about what is this space. So because I cannot really, as a film studies scholar, I cannot immediately have a relationship to policy, neither can I have a relationship to total knowledge, because I know the kind of myth-making that goes on in the world of cinema and in the world of the academy. So the fact that there is that total knowledge possible, that desire needs to be also questioned a little. That total illumination is something that we can achieve. I would like to leave it as incomplete and
which is our goal all along, to create tension and dissonance and to provoke. And I think this conference is off to an auspicious start. So we'll have to end there. We're definitely out of time. I really, really thank you for coming, and I hope you wish me, or help me thank our panelists for a stimulating discussion.
Thank you.